just explaining that we at Roots HRCRC are the UK specialist consultancy for the social sector, and we operate as a social enterprise ourselves in order to provide services to line managers, particularly in the social sector organisations. And we're the only HR consultancy in the UK that use our trading service surpluses to provide pro bono services. And that's enabling us to provide this webinar to you today. The learning outcomes from today's webinar will be identifying the causes and impact of sickness absence. We'll be looking at early intervention strategies, communication and documentation. We'll talk around options for return to work planning, and then finally we'll discuss what sort of actions we can take if things don't improve in terms of attendance.
Thank you, Tracy. So just to make you aware that today's slides will be forwarded following the webinar, and also a recording of the session. So that's just make you aware of that. So we're now going to be looking at the guiding principles when we're looking at managing absence. And I think the most important thing is to treat cases of sickness absence fairly and consistently across your organisation, and policies can help provide that framework to ensure that they are fairly and consistently applied. And let's also remember that the majority of sickness absent cases are genuine, and so it is important to be empathetic towards the employee who is unwell. So I think sometimes we can get caught up in the business needs, but actually that empathy towards those that are unable to attend work. So in that sense, clear and regular communication, accurate records, and fit for purpose policies, they are key to organisations being able to effectively manage sickness absence. Next slide, please, Tracy. So the professional body for HR professionals, the CIPD, they published their health and wellbeing report in September of last year. And this graph shows the increase in days and percentage across all sectors during the last 3 years, which in September 2023 was standing at 7.8 days per employee per year, which was 3.4%. Working time lost. This is the highest sickness absent rate for over a decade. Next slide, please, Tracy. This same report identified the top causes for both short and long-term absence, and the joints, bones and muscles, also known as musculoskeletal. I'm never going to be able to pronounce that name, were top cause for both short and long-term absence. Minor injuries and mental ill health were cause of short-term, and acute medical conditions and stress were top causes for long-term absence. I think when we share the slides with you, you'll be able to zoom in on the graphics a little bit clearer. Thank you, Tracy. So looking at the impact of sickness absence, all organisations, large or small, are affected by sickness absence, and this impact could include the additional workload for colleagues, particularly in small teams and organisations. There's a reduction in productivity, and long-term absence may also have a financial impact, particularly when you need to backfill or get temporary staff in to cover absence. To mitigate the detrimental impact and create a healthy culture and resilient workplace, organisations can look at making sure they have supportive policies, proactive management in terms of regular one-to-ones, and possibly a wellbeing survey and employee wellbeing strategies, which we'll take a little bit more of a look through shortly. In addition, with the increase in remote and hybrid working, this brings an extra level of complexity. The CIPD report found that 78% of employers who took part in the survey were aware of presenteeism amongst colleagues who worked from home. Employees may feel more pressure to continue working when unwell when they're at home. Also, they're not as likely to have colleagues around them asking them if they're okay. Are you okay to be in work? As opposed to when they're in an office environment. So employees can consider even more so in these situations welfare check-ins. So not just having conversations about task-orientated points of discussion, but also just checking in on people, having virtual regular meetings as a team, asking, are you okay? And are you really okay? Is there anything on your mind? Is there anything you really need help with right now? I think that's really important, not just saying, what are you doing? How's it going? But actually, how are you? Okay, next slide, please, Tracy. And the last topic from me at the moment is about creating a healthy workplace. How do we create a healthy workplace? And firstly, what I would be suggesting is ask your employees, what would make the workplace healthier for them? I think we don't have all the answers. So it doesn't need to be a specific well-being survey. You could add a couple of questions into your annual employee survey. Have regular one-to-ones and include that emotional health and well-being conversation in your regular one-to-ones. Consider flexible working, recognising this will be different for different businesses. Ensuring a psychologically safe environment to discuss health. And that's emotional, mental and physical health. Consider health awareness initiatives, possibly daily walking breaks, healthy snacks, and for those that perhaps have more resources, therapeutic gardening or yoga classes, but it doesn't need to be costly. You've also got your employee assistance programs and possibly occupational health support as well. And now over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Fern. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit now about further management of absence. So it's important that managers monitor absence on an ongoing basis. And if you have an absence policy, you may have something in there called trigger points. And where a person passes or approaches a trigger point, this should, as a minimum, lead to a conversation between the manager and the employee. Some policies might say where management believe absence to be at an unreasonable level or words to that effect. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to quantify that. So this is why we, you might want to put in trigger points. And we can certainly talk about that in a lot more detail if anybody would like to talk to us about that. Next steps will depend really on the situation and your own policy, but it could include things like continuing to monitor the situation on an informal basis. You might also want to bring in medical guidance. So this is where we might suggest that you either take a GP report or an occupational health report where applicable. Now, the advantage of having an occupational health specialist report is that GPs, whilst they know their patient, they are not necessarily experts in occupational health. And so an occupational health specialist will more so help the organisation to understand how the individual's ailments might be addressed and supported, reasonable adjustments and so on that can be carried out to help them in the workplace. And finally, we could look at an attendance improvement plan. So you might want to, where somebody's having regular short absences especially, you might want to put a plan together to identify improvements in that and how you will measure that. Talking a little bit further about frequent short-term absence, as Fern said earlier, most absences are genuine, but it doesn't stop you from taking action if it hasn't improved following that improvement plan. So it's very important to follow any policy that you have in place. Now, some organisations might cover sickness absence under disciplinary procedures, or you might have a separate capability policy. Some organisations would go one step further and have a separate procedure within their sickness absence policy. Any of those are acceptable as long as it's clear to the individual employees which policy you're following. Either way, the procedure would be to formally invite the employee to a hearing. You would discuss the absence with them. Depending on the mitigation offered, this could result in issuing some kind of written warning, or what we term as an improvement note. So if you've got a separate capability policy, you might refer to those warnings as improvement notes. The procedure itself is more or less the same. It's a slightly softer procedure because we're looking at people's abilities rather than misconduct, but they have the same standing from a legal perspective. If there's still no improvement, then the steps would escalate in that policy. So you would move through your warning levels, and ultimately you might end up dismissing that individual. Where you dismiss somebody on terms of ill health or capability, it would be with notice, and that would be contractual notice if that's higher than statutory. Now, you might take a slightly different approach during the probationary period. You might, for instance, have tighter parameters on your trigger points, or you might even think about extending a probationary period where somebody has a long-term absence, and that would be considered reasonable, so that you can give the person a little bit longer to be able to prove themselves in the role. Moving on to long-term absence then. If an absence set to be long-term, however you might define that in your policy, make sure that you continue to keep in touch with that individual. So at the beginning of the absence, you should agree with that person how often you'll be making contact, how often you expect them to give you updates, and so on. Don't fall into that trap of out of sight, out of mind. There's nothing worse than trying to pick up a process with an individual if you have not spoken to them for several months and then you suddenly need to deal with it with a procedure. So keep in contact with them so that you're up to date on their current situation. So if that absence continues, set up a meeting with them to discuss their health. We would term this as a welfare meeting. And at this point, you might want to gain permission to get that GP or occupational health review. Once that report has been received, you then might be able to plan for the employee's return, and that might include looking at reasonable adjustments or a phased return to work. So a phased return would be an amendment to hours, it could be an amendment to duties, it could be both. So generally you would ramp up the hours that the person works so that they're not coming straight back in full time if they've been off for a long period. Gives them a bit more chance to adjust. In terms of payments, it's not legally required that you pay somebody full-time if they are only coming back on a part-time basis, but each situation will differ and it's really up to the organisation. So generally, if you're looking at a very short phased return, some organisations will just pay as normal, but if you know it's set to be very long-term, then you might want to consider how you're going to set those payments. If you can't agree on what that phased return looks like, then unfortunately the employee would remain on sick leave. So talking about sick pay entitlements now, all employees are entitled to SSP providing that they earn the relevant minimum earnings, and some organisations might pay enhanced sick pay. So that would be, you might call it occupational or organisational sick pay, or some people call it company sick pay. And consider when that has been exhausted or is about to be exhausted, make sure that you keep the employee informed. So again, they should be aware of how much sick pay they're entitled to, but if they're ill, they might not be keeping a track of that. So it's very important that you, again, keep in contact with them and make sure you tell them in advance if their next pay is going to be reduced because they've run out of sick pay. The management of each case will, of course, depend on the circumstances because everybody's different. No two people will be treated the same, even if they've got the same medical condition. However, it is a possible outcome that if the employee is unable to return to work, you might have to end up in a dismissal procedure. A little bit more about return to work planning. So really focus on the health of the employee and any progress in their conditions, and when appropriate, start planning for that return. So it's very important that you involve the individual in that phased return. Consider asking those individuals what support they think they might need in terms of reasonable work adjustments. You might have some of those from the occupational health report anyway, but please talk to the individual and see what things they think might also help them. And we've talked about the referrals. On returning to work, it's very important that you hold a return to work meeting. Now, this really should be held after every absence, whether somebody has 1 day off or whether they have 6 months off. It's important to have that return to work discussion before that person goes back to work. It could be the day before they're due to return. You don't have to wait until the day they actually come into work. And this is an opportunity not only to discuss to make sure that they're fit enough to return to work, but also to tell them what things they might have missed in their absence, any changes that have happened to the team, and anything else that they need to be aware of in terms of their work. Talking a little bit about disability and how that how you would deal with that in terms of people's absence. The definition of disability from a legal perspective is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial or long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So that's the legal definition. If somebody falls within that definition, then the employer has a requirement to make those reasonable adjustments in order to help that person return to work or to carry out the work more easily. We would always say that you consider those reasonable adjustments whether or not somebody has a disability within that definition, and treat everybody as fairly as you possibly can. If those adjustments can't be made and you just can't do anything to assist that person to return to work, then this is the point where you may still have to look at a dismissal. And again, if somebody has a disability, you still can dismiss them provided you go through a fair process. Access to work is a useful service that's provided by the government, and this is in addition to any reasonable adjustments that the employer is required to make. So an individual can get support with physical or mental health conditions, be in the form of a grant to pay for some practical support, specialist equipment or software. It could also look at supporting travel costs to get people back into work and any physical changes. And there is also support with regard to managing mental health at work. Now, this is a service that the employee has to instigate. So they have to make that first phone call or access the service online. But they certainly should be encouraged to do that in conjunction with the employer. Ultimately, if there's no likelihood that the employee can return to work, you can legally dismiss them on the grounds of ill health. The important things to consider here are, have you acted reasonably? Have you absolutely followed your policies or ACAS guidance if you don't have any policies? And the important thing to note here is, if somebody were to make a claim against you, if you dismiss them, it's extremely important that you follow your own policies, especially if they're over and above the ACAS guidance, because that will stand against you in a tribunal if you have not done that. Have you received up-to-date medical opinions? So often a trap that employers fall into is they get an occupational health report at the beginning of the absence, but they don't necessarily get an updated one if the person's been off for a very long time. So it's very important that you do that. Have all options been considered and exhausted before you take the next step? So have you looked at all reasonable adjustments? Have you looked at being able to change the role? Have you looked at being able to redeploy that person before you consider dismissal? And if you are moving to dismissal, please ensure that you've given the employee fair warning. So you should be inviting them to a dismissal meeting. This is their final opportunity to put forward any mitigating circumstances against that. They should be allowed to be accompanied, and they should be given fair warning that a potential outcome of the meeting could be dismissal.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay.
Hopefully that's given you some context behind when we're looking at managing sickness absence. Just going on to the key points and things to take away from today's session. Each employee situation is unique, and I think that's really important. So like Tracy said, if you've got somebody who is presenting with similar condition, please remember that their circumstances are unique to them. Be consistent, fair and empathetic when you're needing to address sickness absence. Please maintain confidentiality throughout the process. Again, that's really important for employees to trust that when they're having conversations with you about their health, that remains confidential. Don't make assumptions or be aware of bias and stereotyping. I think that's sometimes quite tricky when you're managing the conflict of people not being in the workplace and the business needs. And like Tracy said, consider reasonable adjustments for everyone, not just those employees who have that definition of being disabled, but for everyone. Check through your policies and your supporting paperwork. I think that's really key, and obviously that is an area that we can support with if you want to policy review, just to make sure it's in line with your values as an organisation. And also perhaps if you've had instances where not having trigger points contained in your sickness absence policy has created some inconsistencies. And so yeah, so please do get in touch with us if you'd like us to have a look through and review your policies. And I think we've whizzed through that, Tracy.
Yes.
We've come to the Q&A section.
Yeah.
So we're going to reintroduce Charlotte and see if there's been any questions posed by those that are attending today.
Okay, and if I can just say that thank you to those of you that did submit questions in advance. We have tried to incorporate answers to most of those within the materials if they weren't already in there. But if you think that we've not answered your question correctly, if you've submitted it in advance, then please take this opportunity now to ask us that.